Wait a minute. Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing.
Hello, and welcome to episode 35 of the Laurel and Hardy podcast. And today we are properly kicking off season 2 and beginning our deep dives into Laurel and Hardy's sound shorts. Oh, and in case you didn't know, I'm your host, Patrick Vasey, the editor of the Laurel and Hardy magazine and the author of the forthcoming book, Laurel and Hardy Silence.
I was wondering who it was.
How exciting, we're finally and at long last beginning our coverage of the boys' talkies, and we have so much to look forward to over the coming months. Now, as we're beginning a new part of our journey through the films of Laurel and Hardy, there will be some small, subtle changes to the format of the podcast, as we have a little more to play with and, more importantly, to listen to. But rest assured, these are only slight alterations and will hopefully add to your enjoyment of the show. As you know, this podcast series is a chronological look at the lives and careers of Stan and Babe, and today's episode leads nicely on from the previous show, which was Bonus 10, in which I chatted with Craig Regis about his grandfather, Elmer Regis, the chief sound engineer at the Hal Roach Studios. Now, if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, please do so, as it was a fascinating episode and we learned so much about Elmer and the impact that he had not only on the Hal Roach Studios and Laurel and Hardy, but on the wider world of sound recording. Feedback so far has been brilliant on that episode. I've been really pleased. Elmer Regis, of course, was sent by the Victor Recording Company from their base in Camden, New Jersey, to live in California and work at the Hal Roach Studios and convert the entire operation to talking pictures. So today we resume that story and take a deep dive into Stan and Babe's very first talking picture, Unaccustomed As We Are. Joining us a little later in the show, we'll be welcoming back not one but two of the world's foremost experts in the world of Laurel and Hardy and the Hal Roach Studios, Randy Skretvedt and Richard W. Bann, as we cover one of the most important points in Laurel and Hardy's career. Now, where else are you going to get that? But before we get stuck into all of that, I would like to say welcome and a huge thank you to the following listeners who've become patrons of the podcast over the last few weeks. So hello to Jeff Vokraka, Dave Saff, Derek Porter, Joseph Porter, J.D. Stanton, Dave Wesley, Carrie Clapper, Jesse Martin and Andy Worsfold. So we now have over 100 patrons of the show, and all enjoying exclusive bonus podcast episodes. And for those signed up to the Plumtree tier, they also receive a gift subscription to the Laurel and Hardy magazine, invitations to live podcast recordings, question and answer sessions, and much more. Oh, incidentally, I'll shortly be publishing an early access video recording of my recent interview with the legendary film critic Leonard Maltin on the Patreon page.
You don't believe me.
So if you feel that you gain value from this podcast and you'd like to support it going forward and receive the benefits described, then just head over to patreon.com, patreon.com, or even easier, click on the Patreon link in the podcast show notes or on the Laurel and Hardy podcast website, which I'm sure you know by now is laurelandhardyfilms.com. Clear as mud? Well, that's enough of that. It's now time to turn on the gas, strike a match, because I feel a great big juicy steak coming on. Our film under the microscope today is Unaccustomed As We Are, filmed March 25th to April 1st, 1929. It was released on May the 4th, 1929, produced by Hal Roach, directed by Lewis R. Foster. It was photographed by George Stevens, Len Powers, John McBurney, and Jack Roach, with supporting cast Thelma Todd, Mae Bush, and Edgar Kennedy. Just 11 days after shooting Wrapped on Angora Love, the boys were back in front of the cameras, but it was far from business as usual. 3 months earlier, just before Christmas 1928, the studio had closed for construction work to begin on the process of equipping the Hal Roach Studios in readiness for the production of talking pictures. As Stan and Babe stepped out onto the newly converted soundstage on the evening of March 25th, 1929, they entered a whole new world. To a large extent, they were back to square one. The actors and the technical crew had to learn quickly how not only to use the new equipment, but to master it. Earlier that same day, Robert Bob McGowan and his little rascals, including Weezer, Mary Ann, Farina and Joe Cobb, were the first to test out the new recording equipment. The production of their first talkie, cleverly titled Small Talk, ran in tandem with the Laurel and Hardy unit, with our gang shooting during the day until their 5 p.m. curfew, and Stan, Babe and their crew taking the evening shift. The filming schedule continued this way, with the boys completing their picture 5 days before the kids wrapped on April 6th. Of all the 4 series in production at the start of 1929, namely Laurel and Hardy, Our Gang, Charlie Chase and the Roach All-Stars, it was McGowan who arguably had the most difficult task adjusting to the new medium. Wrangling a group of children and getting them to follow instructions from behind the camera on a silent production in which no sound, no matter how cacophonous, was being recorded, was one thing. Getting them to learn action and dialogue and then repeat it without continual direction and encouragement from the sidelines was entirely different. It must then have been a much less frustrating experience for Lewis R. Foster, returning for his 4th Laurel and Hardy picture in a row, as he navigated his way through the boys' initial attempt at talking pictures. The film's pessimistically doom-laden working title, Their Last Word, was understandably changed before release to Unaccustomed As We Are, a much more suitable handle given their novice status within the new sound revolution, and a clever nod to the well-known phrase, Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking. In October 1928, the Victor Talking Machine Company, the organisation newly licensed to handle sound operations for Roach, sent one of their best men, Elmer Regis, to relocate to Culver City, and he instantly became the resident expert, heading up the new 9-person sound department. His expertise was so valued by Roach that Regis remained at the studio until 1957, apart from a brief spell between 1931 and 34. Elmer Regis was not motivated by power or status, nor did he even crave recognition for his efforts. His only motivation was to do his job well. He was always interested in sound technology, designing and building his own amateur or ham radio when he was just 16 years old. His early career included joining the Merchant Navy as a Marconi radio officer, building and engineering the first radio station based in New York City, and he helped to install New York's telephone system for AT&T. Working for Western Electric, Regis was part of the team that first developed electric recording, a system that used microphones in place of the conventional recording cones. With his experience and knowledge growing, Elmer installed the first electric recording studio at Columbia Records, before doing the same for the Victor Company at their studio in the Camden Trinity Baptist Church, Camden, New Jersey, the same studio in which the synchronized music and sound effects track would later be recorded for several Hal Roach comedy shorts. The arrival of talking pictures created numerous technical problems for studios that demanded on-the-spot solutions. Fortunately for Roach, Elmer Regis was a problem solver. If something was broken, he could repair it. If something wasn't fit for purpose, he'd design and build something that was. In essence, he was one essential ingredient that made the studio's transition to sound possible and appear seamless. The sound quality on early talking pictures across all studios was far from perfect, but the industry's technicians toiled endlessly to come up with better and better solutions. Trying to maintain silence on the set while shooting was in progress was a challenge that was reasonably controllable and only took a little time to establish appropriate rules in the formation of new habits, at least for those used to the noise and bustle of the silent days. One of the biggest challenges they faced, however, was not the noise of the crew, but the noise of the cameras. Since the very dawn of movie making, hand-cranked cameras had been used by cinematographers with little or no thought given to the noise produced by the camera itself. And why would they? Noise was completely irrelevant in that purely silent medium. When studios began their experiments with talking pictures, the continuous whirring and clicking sounds emanating from the machines and drowning out the actors' voices became only too evident. Solutions needed to be found, and quickly. Initial experiments of wrapping the cameras in materials to deaden the sound proved unsuccessful. The most common and ponderous solution employed by many studios was to enclose the cameras and their operators in custom-built soundproof booths, with the cameras shooting through a large window. However, if multiple angles were required to film a particular scene, then multiple booths needed to be built and situated accordingly. These large, hot and stuffy booths made the filming process uncomfortable for the cinematographers, cumbersome and ultimately incredibly static. Laurel and Hardy's first talkie was shot using 4 cameras, all enclosed in soundproof booths. One lens covered the long shot, the second the medium shots, and the remaining 2 filmed the hilarious close-ups. The race was on to create quieter and more mobile solutions. Laurel and Hardy's first talking picture is a pivotal moment in the boys' history. Since the summer of 1927, when they were publicly recognised and accepted as a bona fide comedy team, Stan and Ollie's popularity had increased with every film. Granted, their particular brand of comedy wasn't to everybody's taste, subjective as entertainment is, but by and large they had never been more adored than they were by the spring of 1929. But as many stars were to find out, the adoration of the masses is nothing if not fickle. Many silent stars' first talkies, such as Harold Lloyd, Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, were huge financial successes, but once the public's eager curiosity to hear their favourite actors speak was satisfied, and the response to them was less than positive, their follow-up movies were progressively less successful. Stan and Babe's career hung in the balance. Their fans waited to hear the boys utter their first words on screen. Would they sound anything like their physical appearances suggested they might? Would audiences accept the sound of the comics' voices? This was Judgment Day. Fortunately, Stan Laurel's voice, with its transatlantic tone and just a hint of a lisp, was perfect. It vocally reflected the childlike simplicity of the character's physical mannerisms and made Stanley even more lovable than the silent version. Even so, Stan was still extremely nervous about his voice and requested immediate playbacks on every take. Incredibly, Oliver Hardy's voice also synced seamlessly with his well-established character. His warm southern accent could be charming and welcoming one moment, and then pompous and overbearing the next. Miraculously, the 2 actors took the transition from silent film to talking pictures effortlessly in their stride. The age of the talkies would not be a death sentence for Laurel and Hardy as it was for many of their contemporaries. On the contrary, it would become their playground. They found that words could be played with and would become just as effective comic props for them as planks of wood, fruit pies and musical instruments had been for them in their silent pictures. In their first attempt at an all-talking comedy, Unaccustomed As We Are is arguably more valuable as a point of academic interest than it is entertainment. It's a fascinating piece of movie history, and whilst it's a reasonably decent comedy, it's perhaps not up to the standard that modern audiences might expect when sitting down to watch a Laurel and Hardy picture. Knowing only too well that the movie-going public was excited to hear the stars speak, the picture has an understandable reliance on dialogue to the detriment of the visual comedy. However, it's unfair to be too critical of this film, as one must always consider its highly experimental context. The plot doesn't break any new ground. It's a typical bedroom farce with the action taking place in only 4 different rooms, namely the Hardys' apartment, the living room and the kitchen, the Kennedys' apartment, the living room, and the hallway between the 2. This was probably intentionally done to keep the technical demands of the film as simple as possible. The film opens with Ollie leading Stan along the hallway towards his apartment, and immediately the first lines of dialogue ever recorded by our comic heroes are heard.
We're going to have a great big juicy steak with the mushroom sauce, strawberries with the whipped cream mixed down in the bottom of it, a cup of coffee and a big black cigar.
To which Stan answers,
Any naps?
This might not be up there with the most famous lines of dialogue in movie history, but it is very effective at instantly setting up the Stan and Ollie characters. Ollie is the leader, taking Stan to his apartment and informing him of what he will make his unsuspecting wife cook for them. Stan is clearly the quiet, submissive part of the duo. content to be led in the same way that a child unquestionably and loyally follows their parent. Interestingly, in this scene we're also able to identify where the microphone was hidden. As Ollie speaks his lines, the first few words are quiet, but as the boys proceed down the hallway, coming to stop directly under a light fitting, his voice becomes much more audible. The light fitting was the ideal place to conceal one of the rather sizable microphones, but having the actors move on set resulted in a betrayal of its hiding place. In these early experimental days of trying to clearly record actors speaking their lines before the invention of the boom mic, the sound technicians had to craftily conceal microphones around the set wherever they could, such as in flower arrangements and telephone receivers, and even on the bodies of the actors. Although the obvious technical limitations slightly hinder this picture, one aspect that is completely triumphant and astounding, given the fact that this is their very first attempt at a talkie, is the clever and creative ways in which sound is utilised throughout. For example, as the boys tiptoe into Ollie's apartment, Ollie melodically calls to his wife,
Yoo-hoo! Yoo-hoo!
to which his unseen wife answers from another room and in a very abrupt voice,
What do you mean, yoo-hoo?
Ollie's bubble is burst, and the homely picture of domestic bliss that he just painted for Stan is smashed in an instant. 'Twas ever thus. Another brilliant use of sound follows soon after. Mrs. Hardy is not pleased that Ollie has brought another bum home with the expectation that she'll feed them all. She begins to scold him, and once she's in full flow, Ollie turns on the gramophone. His wife unwittingly begins to nag in time with the rhythm of the record, while Stan sways along in the background. She finally becomes sensible of what's happening and angrily leaves, promising to never come back.
Now I've listened to you. You listen to me. I'm simply sick and tired. I'm not going to stand it any longer. My mother told me that you'd make a slave out of me and keep me in this house till morning, noon, tonight. And I'm not too sick and tired of it. And I'm not going to do it anymore. If you think for 1 minute that I'm going to go in that kitchen and cook for you, I'm not. I'm simply not going to do it. Just as well. Might as well. No, it's not, because I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to. What do you mean by saying this when I'm trying to talk to you? You big brute. Now I'm going home to my mother, that's all. I'm just sick and tired of it. I'm not going to stand any longer, do you hear me? I'm going home to my mother. That's what she is. She told me what you do. She told me you were no good. Said you were absolutely no good. And this time, let me tell you something. I'm through. You get me through, and I'm going to stay put.
Not to be completely embarrassed in front of his friend, Ollie sets about attempting to prepare the meal for Stan himself. It's during this sequence that we hear Ollie's pained plea for the very first time.
Why don't you do something to help me?
What can I do?
Set the table. That's simple. You don't have to use any brains for that.
As usual, Stan tries to help, and between them, they almost burn down the kitchen. The role of Mrs. Hardy is inhabited by the brilliant Mae Bush in only her second role with the boys, the first being in Love 'Em and Weep, way back in Stan and Babe's pre-team days of 1927. Bush's life and movie career had been something of a roller coaster from her first appearance on screen in 1912. Whilst employed by Mack Sennett, she quickly rose to star status, but then allegedly became entangled in an almost fatal love triangle with Sennett and his fiancée Mabel Normand, and subsequently had to leave the studio in shame. However, Mae's determination to succeed and her talent ensured that she was able to secure more high-profile roles at several studios over the years that followed, including at MGM. Throughout her career, Bush appeared in approximately 120 films, 12 of which were memorable performances in Laurel and Hardy comedies. Unaccustomed As We Are was the first time she played Ollie's wife, but she would seal her position in the hearts of Laurel and Hardy fans around the world for that same role in films such as Sons of the Desert and Their First Mistake. Mae Bush was not the only female supporting actor in the boys' first talkie. Another fresh face awarded her Laurel and Hardy debut in this picture was a newcomer to the Hal Roach Studio, Thelma Todd. Todd, newly signed to a 5-year contract at the Roach lot, was born in Massachusetts on July 29, 1906, and after leaving school she trained as a schoolteacher. She found her way to Hollywood after being spotted by a talent scout at a beauty contest and soon moved west to California to take up a position first with Paramount Pictures and then First National. Thelma appeared in supporting roles in several silent dramas alongside actors such as Milton Sills and Richard Dix. In 1929, Todd found herself at the Hal Roach Studios, where she would become a familiar face supporting Laurel and Hardy, Charlie Chase and Harry Langdon, and made such an impact that she was awarded her own series in 1931, co-starring with Zazu Pitts, who was later replaced by Patsy Kelly. The rest of the picture is standard farce, with Hardy's good-hearted neighbour, Mrs. Kennedy, Thelma Todd, attempting to help Ollie and Stan cook a meal after Mrs. Hardy, Mae Bush, has stormed out. To avoid Todd being found in a compromising position by the returning Mrs. Hardy and Thelma's husband, Police Officer Kennedy, she's hidden in a trunk. Mrs. Hardy is kept ignorant of the fact that there's a woman concealed, but Kennedy gets wise and helps the nervous boys take the trunk over to his apartment. Not realising that it's his wife that's in the box, he tells the boys that if they're going to play around, they need to be more careful, like he is. Never let your wife find out.
Making whoopee, huh? Say, it's a great thing for you fellas that my wife isn't home. Say, listen now. If you fellas are gonna take chances, you gotta be more careful. The big thing is, to get just as far away from your wife as you can. You fellas should go out on my beat with me some night to thoroughly appreciate my technique. Now, come on, we'll go over to the wife. And I'll take and let that cluck out of the trunk, and nobody will be any the wiser. Come on, you know, we married men, we gotta stick together.
This is all overheard by the now seething Mrs. Kennedy, and all hell eventually breaks loose. Perhaps understandably, Unaccustomed As We Are is not the best example of a Laurel and Hardy talkie. Too much emphasis is placed on dialogue during the first half of the picture, which gives it a very static feel. It also suffers from technical issues, such as the sound quality being pretty rough, and the hidden microphones are sometimes too far from the actors to pick up the dialogue consistently. In addition, the scope of the film is hindered due to its limited use of sets. But this is all excusable given the highly experimental nature of the film, and even despite these drawbacks, it still manages to be a very enjoyable talkie. And it's amazing to see how competently all the actors make the leap into talking pictures. The attraction of Stan and Babe's voices drew the crowds. But as the Laurel and Hardy pictures were placed as the supporting short to the main programme, it could be argued that less pressure was on them to get it right first time. Perhaps audiences would be more forgiving of the funny chaps in the comedy shorts. Either way, the response to the boys' first talkie was overwhelmingly positive. Even the usually disapproving Variety managed to pay a small compliment. Quote, "They picked an aged, too-real slapstick comedy theme off the equally aged shelf, flicked off the dust, and added dialogue to make an efficient sound short. In doing so, opening another gate to possibilities. If the talking screen can do so much for this familiar comic document, with actual sound spotted here and there in place of silent pantomime, it might do more for countless other and better formulas used in two-reelers in the past. In Unaccustomed As We Are, the rotund Oliver Hardy brings his meek pal Stan Laurel home to supper. For a howl finish, Laurel misses the first top step on the way home and falls the rest of the way. His downward flight is not in view, but recorded in sound, and a climax that could not have been accomplished in silence. Hardy and Laurel dovetail perfectly as the comedy combo. Particularly good in comic delivery is Hardy, who steals the picture most of the while." End quote. And that was from Variety, May 4th, 1929. More reviews. Unaccustomed As We Are, the Hal Roach comedy held the final 15 minutes of the show, and it was just one continual howl of laughter from the start to the finish. That was from Motion Picture News, May 4th, 1929. Laurel and Hardy in Unaccustomed As We Are, Laugh Riot. Billed as the first Hal Roach all-talking comedy, these two outstanding comedians do one of their best films to date. At the Capitol in New York, Laurel and Hardy kept them laughing steadily throughout the entire 2 reels. That was the Film Daily, May 5th, 1929. Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, probably the funniest comedy team making pictures today, will be seen in their first all-talking comedy called Unaccustomed As We Are. It has, to use theatrical jargon, stopped the show in 2 New York theatres, the Paramount and the Astor, where it was shown on the programme with the Broadway melody. That was the Ithaca Journal, May 25th, 1929. Comedians make hit in talking picture. The house nearly came down last night when Laurel and Hardy stepped out to show off their first all-talking comedy, Unaccustomed As We Are. These fellows have been the favourite comedians among many people in Marysville for a long time. They came and laughed at their foolishness, but they overlaughed last night until they cried. Boys down in the front rows were laughing so hard that they were choking and gasping for breath. It's a great comedy. That was from the Marysville Journal, June 15th, 1929. And the final one, Unaccustomed As We Are, a real honest-to-goodness comedy, and you can tell them so, for it will make them laugh. Oliver Hardy's and Thelma Todd's voices record very good, the others, fair. And that was from the Exhibitor's Herald World, October 5th, 1929. Stan, Babe and Hal Roach couldn't have wished for a better or more positive start to their adventures in talking pictures. Their first experiment using the new technology was an undeniable success and had been very well received. The clever and creative use of both sound and dialogue paved the way for more invention and would push the limitations of the recording equipment to its limits and beyond. What followed was an era of further technical advancement where Chief Sound Engineer Elmer Regis and his small team of technicians had to be on top of their game and constantly innovating to keep up with the ideas and demands of the studio's creative dream team.
Good night, Mr. Hardy.
Our guest joining us on the podcast today is someone who was very familiar to you by now. It's the author of the definitive work on the boys' film career, Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies. It's our good friend, Randy Skretvedt. So welcome back to the podcast, Randy.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm always happy to join you on these audio adventures.
Adventures indeed, and it's always terrific to have you on the show, Randy. And today this is really exciting as we are now starting our journey into a new era of Laurel and Hardy films, namely, of course, the talkies. Before we begin on the film in question, Unaccustomed As We Are, I just thought it would be a nice opportunity to chat with you. I've spoken to Craig Regis in the last episode about Elmer, and also Chris Again and I talked about, we had a bit of a retrospective look at the whole of the silent period. But I just thought, as we've got you on today, just in a few words, how would you describe the importance of the boys' silent era on everything else that sort of came afterwards? If that's not too big a question.
Yeah, well, of course, the silent era is where they found their characters, where they found their costumes. I mean, a lot of what we love most about Laurel and Hardy was developed during that period, which really, it's amazing to think that it's really 2.5 years, essentially, that they went from being two actors playing widely different parts to being this seamless partnership of Stan and Ollie. From I think September of 26 is when they shot Duck Soup, and they finished making their last silent Angora Love in March of 1929. So, that relatively short period, they became Laurel and Hardy. Now, of course, those characters were, I think, deepened and enriched with the addition of sound, because the characters really, I don't think Laurel and Hardy are really, they're fully mature characters until about 1930. Even so, the silents are, a number of them are wonderful films and among Laurel and Hardy's best, whether they're silent or sound. And of course, Stan Laurel was on record as saying that he preferred the silents, or at least preferred making the silents. I'm sure they were much easier when you didn't have to worry about learning lines and making sure everybody in the studio was quiet.
Yes, exactly.
You could still have people laughing behind the camera, which I'm sure comedians appreciated in the silent days. And of course, that was no longer possible when talkies came in. But yeah, the number of the silents are wonderful films, and I'm glad that they are finally being restored and being brought back to view through Serge Bromberg in beautiful new editions on Blu-ray. So I think we're going to have a renaissance of interest in the silent films, and of course, your forthcoming book, will be a tremendous aid in that effort.
Oh, I hope so. Yeah, just picking up on something you said there, I do sometimes wonder. I mean, silent film, obviously, at the point when silent film died, it was a wonderful art form, and it was the advances and the things that they were doing with silent film was superb. So it was a shame in a way that it finished when it did.
Obviously, when silent film was shoved aside for talkies, silent film was at its technical peak because you'd had 30 years of silent film at that point, and it kept evolving technically.
Yes.
And it's interesting. Laurel and Hardy really came in as talkies were coming in, because I think, as I said, Duck Soup was filmed in September of 26. Well, the Warner Brothers issued Don Juan, which was the first feature film with a synchronized score, on August 6th of 1926.
Yeah.
So the rise of sound in film was a parallel event to Laurel and Hardy's entire silent film career. And, everybody was sort of looking over their shoulder, wondering whether this was going to be the future of film, or whether this was just going to be a fad that would quickly die out. Nobody knew. So
it's almost sort of poetic in a way, that where a lot of stars, silent comedians, failed, it was the death of their careers. I almost feel that talkies was kind of like Laurel and Hardy's, not savior, but it just gave them that extra element that really would lift them and make sure they carried on, without a stutter.
Well, for one thing, being a team, each one had somebody to talk to.
Yes.
That's where Chaplin and Keaton and Langdon and Lloyd, being solo comedians, had to kind of figure out a way to put dialogue into the films. Whereas Laurel and Hardy were always working together, and so there was a natural reason for them to talk.
Yes.
And happily, they didn't go for jokes or puns or verbal humor beyond what was natural to them, which would be, as we have in Unaccustomed As We Are, we have Ollie saying, "Why don't you do?" Doesn't he say, "Why don't you do something to help me?"
Yes. Yeah.
So that's the first of the catchphrases in their very first talking film. And watching this film, I watched it about 4 or 5 times last night, including the silent version. And I was struck again and again by what a good vocal performer Hardy was. He was a film performer, unlike Stan, who had many years of being on the stage and talking on the stage. Hardy was in movies right from the get-go. I think he'd been in vaudeville briefly as a part of a vocal quartet, the 20th Century Four, back in his Jacksonville days, but he really was not a speaking actor. And yet, in his first talking film, he has a beautiful, well-modulated voice. There's plenty of inflections. He knows how to dramatically put over a line, and he's very, very good as a vocal performer right from the get-go. Stan doesn't talk very much in this film, and I remember, I'm trying to think if it was Richard Currier, but somebody that I talked to said that he was very concerned about his voice, and he wanted to hear playbacks on everything because
that's right.
As you know, his S's were rather sibilant. He said I had kind of a lisp, and he said that's why I never wanted to be a dramatic actor, but I wasn't suited for anything else but a comic.
Yes.
So he had that to worry about. Also, I remember Anita Garvin telling me that the first time that she had made a talking film, it wasn't at the Roach Studio. It might have been at Fox, because she did some shorts with Clark and McCullough around the same time. And she said,
that was the first time I heard myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the dailies.
I see.
And the first thing that comes on is I'm on the telephone. talking, and I thought, oh my God, here I am lisping all over the place. I thought, oh, I'm ruined. I'm finished. Oh, everything. And fortunately, the next person on the scene did the same thing, so I knew it was the sound and not me. But for a few minutes there, wow.
You could see your whole career flashing.
Everything down the drain. Oh, it was an awful feeling.
And I gather that there's a record called "I Can't Sleep in the Movies Anymore," which is from 1929, which is about the transition from silent films to talkies and how people like to go to the movie theater and just go to sleep lulled by the pipe organ that was playing. They didn't watch the movie. They just went there to get a nice nap, and they can't do it anymore because there's so much noise emanating from the screen. And there's a whole verse of that song which is all about the lisping that everybody does. They're all speak with a lisp. And I thought that must be something that was common to the speaker system or the reproduction of that time, that S's did not register well. So anyway, that was something that Stan was concerned about. But anyway, everybody really in Unaccustomed As We Are is a very good vocal performer. Mae Bush is terrific right from the get-go. In her second ever film at the Hal Roach Studios, the first one being Love 'Em and Weep, she's very good. She clearly was not afraid of the microphone. I don't know if she had made any sound films before this. I should have checked on that. But she just takes command of every scene that she's in. And another thing about the scenes that she has with Babe is that they were very good at what we now call improv, because when they start having the argument by the phonograph, that clearly is not scripted dialogue. They're just they know what they have to get across in that moment of the scene, and they're coming up with their own words, but doing so brilliantly.
You've heard me speak about Stan, haven't you?
Yes.
That's him.
Well, what about it?
Well, we were down playing a little game of pool this afternoon, and he got hungry. And I told him about those big steaks that you cooked, and the strawberry souffle with the whipped cream beat up in it, and that good coffee you made, and some nuts. Oh, I forgot to tell you. He likes nuts.
Oh, he does. Well, isn't that lovely?
And I told him if he'd come up, you'd be glad to fix something.
Oh, you did? Well, get a load of this, big boy. I'm sick and tired of cooking for you and all the bums that you happen to bring up here for dinner. And I'm not going to do it any longer. If you think for a moment that all I'm going to do is stay in that kitchen, leave over that hot stove, I don't care what I told you. I'm telling you now that I'm not going to do it anymore. This is my birthday.
This boy's a friend of mine. I've known him for 5 years.
I don't care if you've known him for 105 years. I'm not going to cook. And you're not going to make a slave out of me for all the bums that you have to bring up here for dinner. You're not trying. No, you've done it. You earn the money and I do the cooking. That's all I do. And besides that, what else do I do? All you do is bring food. And all you keep out of this. I'm not trying anything. I'm just telling you something. That I'm not going to do it anymore. Now, all shut up. Gosh, I can't get a word in edgeways of you two.
And then of course they have the gag where Hardy turns on the phonograph and Parade of the Wooden Soldiers comes on, and gradually Mae starts to adopt the rhythm of the song. I'm not going to do it if you think that I'm going to cook the da, 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 and she does that perfectly, all within the same shot.
Yes.
So the performers in that film, and Thelma Todd and Edgar Kennedy also, are all very, very good vocal performers, and as they would prove in many subsequent films.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think the talking about the lisps and the sort of technical restrictions, because this is an early talkie, especially for the Hal Roach Studios. It's obviously one of the very first talkies, and it makes me laugh. The very first scene where the boys are walking down the corridor, and you can hear the voices get louder as they approach the light fitting.
Right. Yes. Yeah, you can tell that's where the
hiding.
microphone is. Yeah.
Yes.
I think by this time they had probably figured out the boom.
Yeah.
There are several different people who took credit for creating that. But the very first, the microphones were stationary, and the actors had to move around the stationary mic.
Yes.
Before. It may well have been Ruben Mamoulian who figured out the boom mic, because if you've ever seen his film Applause, it's made in the spring of 1929, and it's a very fluid, visually sound film. I mean, he found ways to coordinate that bulky sound equipment and make a film that was not people standing still and being enslaved to the microphone placement. And he may well have been the guy to figure out the boom microphone. But as I say, Roach and particularly MGM, the distributor, came rather late to the party of talking films. I was, as I mentioned to you earlier before we began, if you see the Kevin Brownlow documentary series Hollywood, the 13th chapter is about the transition to sound, and it shows you clips of sound movies from 1893 going all the way up to Warner Brothers' film of Don Juan, which was the first Vitaphone feature film. And that was the sort of the big premiere for Vitaphone, which was on August 6th of 1926. And that did not have dialogue. It only had music and sound effects. And at first, the Warner Brothers thought that was going to be the attraction was going to be that you had a symphonic score and could have that even in a small town where they normally would just have a piano or maybe a pipe organ. And as it turned out, the hit of the show was instead the Vitaphone shorts, which had vaudeville performers, some of whom spoke as well as singing. And so as a result of that, the Warner Brothers began making, thanks for posterity, they made a whole bunch of these shorts with vaudeville people who were essentially killing their careers by by putting their precious 10 minutes of material, which is all they had, on film and therefore competing with themselves. But it preserved, and thanks to the late, great Ron Hutchinson, who rescued a lot of these films, we have a lot of American vaudeville preserved thanks to these films. And then, of course, The Jazz Singer came out on October 6th of 1927. And again, the thing that everybody noticed there was of course, Jolson singing, but the scene between Jolson and Eugenie Besserer playing his mother, where Jolson starts to ad-lib dialogue, and he's, being his ebullient Al Jolson self, he's starting to talk about how he's going to be rich and famous and take her away from all this and get her a nice house and and it's so natural and so charming. That was what made people sit up and take notice and made other people think, we can have actual dramatic scenes with sound. And so the Warner Brothers made the first all-talking feature, The Lights of New York, released on July 6, 1928. And MGM finally started to dip their toe in the water in November of 1928. MGM's philosophy was, whenever there's a new technology, we will let the other studios work out all the bugs. And when they finally got it right, then we'll get into it. So MGM didn't win the technical awards. Usually Fox or Warner Brothers would win the technical awards. If you look at the Academy Awards, like, for example, in 1953, Fox came out with CinemaScope, and then widescreen, of course, later became the standard. So Fox was usually the leader. Fox, of course, came out with Movietone, which was sound on film, and that supplanted Vitaphone, which was sound on records. So again, there's Fox making a technological advancement. But MGM's first part-talking feature was Alias Jimmy Valentine from November 5th of 1928. And the first all-talking feature was The Broadway Melody from February 1st of 1929, which became the second film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. Now, as far as regards Laurel and Hardy, their last feature, or their last short in silent, was Angora Love, released at the very end of 1929, December 14th of 1929, and it had been filmed in March. So that had been on the shelf for all those months. And in fact, that's a month after MGM's last silent feature, which is The Kiss with Greta Garbo, which came out on November 16th. So I think that Angora Love is actually the last silent film released by a major American studio ever. I think everybody else had pretty much well converted to sound by the end of 29. There were some very, very low budget Poverty Row westerns that were shot in silent in 1930 because there were a lot of rural theaters that couldn't afford sound equipment, and so there was still a market for that. And in fact, I was going through some articles on the wonderful Lantern Media History Digital Project, and I found a couple of articles this is one. Whoops. This is one from June 22nd of 1929 from the Exhibitor's Herald World. It says, Hal Roach to make only sound comedies. Silent gone forever. And silent comedy, Roach is quoted as saying, silent comedies are gone forever, and unless there should be some unexpected return to the vogue of silent films or an unforeseen demand for non-talking pictures, we will continue to make all our comedies with dialogue and sound. And so that's in, let's see, that's June 22nd of 29. Okay, then a month later, in July, we have silent versions of 20 of next year's releases are scheduled. So they did in fact make, evidently they made 20 silent versions of talking films. And as you know, there is a silent edition of Unaccustomed As We Are, an official Roach Studios silent edition, and which has almost more titles than it has actual footage.
But it would do, I suppose.
Well, something that's interesting about Unaccustomed As We Are never really hit me before, but watching it yesterday, I realized that it starts out being very dialogue oriented. As you mentioned, there's that scene in the hallway.
Oh, good evening, Mr. Hardy.
Good evening, Mrs. Kennedy. This is my friend, Mrs. Kennedy.
Good evening.
I brought him home to dinner, Mrs. Kennedy.
Oh, how lovely of you, Mr. Hardy.
How is Mr. Kennedy, Mrs. Kennedy?
Oh, he's very well, thank you, Mr. Hardy.
Is Mr. Kennedy home, Mrs. Kennedy?
Not yet, Mr. Hardy. I must be going. Good night, Mr. Hardy.
Good night, Mrs. Kennedy. That was Mrs. Kennedy. Well, what's the matter? I was wondering who it was.
And then there's the scene, the dialogue scene with Mae Bush, where she gets angry and storms out. As the film progresses, it gets more and more oriented toward physical, visual comedy. And by the end of it, almost all of the important information is conveyed either through gesture or whistling.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Isn't that interesting? That
yeah, that's a good point.
At the end of it, it's you know, Kennedy's at the door, and people explain, you know, just look around with no dialogue, and then Kennedy whistles like. And then once again, and there are several examples of this in the film where you're hearing something off screen, which was thought of as a major innovation. You know, obviously it's commonplace to us now, but at the time, the idea that you could have action happening conveyed only through sound effects, you know, that was something new. You didn't have to show everything happening. You could imagine it. And of course, what happens is that Thelma Todd comes and smashes a vase over Edgar Kennedy's head. But Ollie doesn't see this, and so when he sees Edgar Kennedy crumpled in the hallway, he thinks that Stan has done it. And of course, Stan takes the credit for it, and he whistles again. He goes.
That's right. Yes, he does.
Doesn't say anything. But then at the very end, when he's at the top of the stairs, he says,
"Good night, Mr. Hardy."
Sort of a reference back to all of the Mrs. Kennedy stuff at the beginning of the film. And then he falls down the stairs, but you don't see it. And I remember that was one thing that Richard Currier said to me the first day that I met him. We got on that topic, and he said, that's the one scene and the one picture they made I will never forget. And he says, that made such an impression on me because he's at the top of the stairs and you see him just fall at the beginning, but then you just heard him fall down the stairs, and you saw Hardy's reactions, which were sort of coordinated to, I guess, every landing on the stairs that he was falling down. And he said, you know, that made such an impression on me. There was such an innovation. So, you know, so they use sound very creatively in Unaccustomed As We Are. You know, they were thinking in terms of sound as providing gags, not just dialogue. And they kind of do it again with the explosions coming from the kitchen. I mean, you do see flame coming out, but it's after you hear boom
That's right. Yeah.
from the kitchen twice, once for Hardy and once for Thelma Todd. And there's another sound gag, which is when Hardy means to strike a match on the side of his trousers and doesn't realize that he's actually got a nail, and he thinks he has the match, and you hear rip, and then he looks, and then you see that he's torn his trousers there. So that's an audible gag as well. So it's interesting when you see the official Roach Studios silent version of the film. They cut out the phonograph gag where May takes on the rhythm of the Parade of the Wooden Soldiers, and they drastically shortened the last shot where Stan falls. They don't keep it holding on Ollie as he's watching Stan fall. They just fade out. So it's quite a bit shorter than the sound version is. And I remember when I was in my teens and buying all the Laurel and Hardy films from Black Hawk Films in Davenport, Iowa, which is where everybody of my generation who was a film buff, we all got our Laurel and Hardy films that way on Super 8 sound or 16 millimeter because there was no home video yet. The discs were missing for Unaccustomed As We Are, which is why it was never part of the television package. They didn't know where the discs had gone, and finally, and I was surprised to realize it was this late. It was February of 1979. They finally found the discs and were able to issue it in sound. I thought it had been around 1975, but no, it was. I went through all of the Black Hawk bulletins are online, and I went through them and said, "Where's the first issue where they have the the soundtrack?" So I had bought what you could get, which was the silent version. And the funny thing is, if you put that film through rewinds, as I had to do to clean the film occasionally, you're seeing all this black title footage and very little actual footage of Laurel and Hardy. There's so many titles. I think that they had a cutting continuity, which would have given them every line of dialogue. And by golly, they felt compelled to give you every line of dialogue, which is not the case with the official Roach silent version, which was found some years later. There are several sections where, if you know the talkie version, you know what they're saying, but they don't have titles for it. They tried to keep the titles to a minimum, even though, let's see, how many titles are there? I counted the titles. I think there are 81 titles in the silent version of Unaccustomed As We Are, whereas Big Business has 17. Wow. They always tried to keep titles to an absolute minimum, and they couldn't do it with Unaccustomed As We Are because there's just so much of it was just motivated by dialogue.
Which goes to show, if you, like as you said, the sort of second half of the film is largely pantomime.
Yeah.
So it must be very heavily dialogue driven in the first half.
It gets less and less dialogue oriented as it goes along.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I know I haven't seen many early talkies. I'm talking not Laurel and Hardy, obviously, just standard across the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Those innovations that we talked about, where the action is off screen and you can't actually see it, but you can hear it. Were any other stars doing that or studios doing that? Do you know?
Well, I'm sure that eventually that became part of the standard vocabulary.
Yeah.
I would imagine Hitchcock probably would have been doing some of that, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if in the movie Applause, the Ruben Mamoulian film, he was so innovative in that there probably is something where he has something going on off camera that you can hear. In fact, even in there's what is it, Four Sons? It's a John Ford film about World War I, and it is a silent film that has a synchronized score and sound effects, but there's a key moment in it where you hear a dying German soldier and he's calling for his mother. And you hear him saying, Mother, you hear the voice, and they react visually and they say, and then there's a title saying, he's calling for his mother. But you hear that. So that's an interesting use of off-screen sound conveying something that's pretty important information.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. I was just wondering, as we were saying, the Roach Studios and MGM were late to the party, but I wonder how much they learned from watching the people that had gone before them, and also, of course, the technology was a lot better because
right.
when you look at the way they made the early talkies with the camera booths that were almost suffocating the cameramen, wrapping the cameras in blankets and all the rest of it, trying to stifle the noise of the cameras.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know if I mean, Courier did remember the use of the boxes, where they had the camera and the cameramen in there, and of course they would with the hot lights. A lot of times they would faint with the heat in those boxes. I don't know if that was the case on Unaccustomed as We Are. Now, somewhere, there are 4 cameramen credited on that film, which is highly unusual. I think it's the only film where there's more than one cameraman. And somewhere I found that they shot it essentially like I Love Lucy, the 3 camera configuration that Desi Arnaz and Carl Freund put together so that they could shoot a live show on 35 millimeter film and have different camera angles. Well, that appears to have been what they did for Unaccustomed as We Are. They had one for a master shot, and then one for 2 shots, and one for close-ups. And supposedly, I don't know how in the world you get that many big bulky cameras. I think that's a little bit suspect because concurrently with Unaccustomed as We Are, our gang was shooting a film called Small Talk. And I will have to go and see how many cameramen are credited on that one. But the Roach Studio basically had the one set of sound recording equipment. And so they shot our gang during the day, which they had to do because of child labor laws. And then they shot Unaccustomed as We Are at night. And they may have actually used a couple of the same sets for both films. But that because they wanted to maximize the use of the sound equipment and get those films out there before this sound thing went away and nobody wanted it anymore. They shot those 2 films concurrently. So let's see. I have the filming dates here. So Small Talk and Unaccustomed We Are both began filming on March 25th. And Unaccustomed as We Are was the first one completed because they filmed it from March 25th through the 30th, and they had retakes on April 1st. And it was released on May 4th of 1929. It was the first Roach talkie to be released, and this was in advance of the already completed Silence, Double Whoopee, Bacon Grabbers, and Angora Love. And then Small Talk took longer to film because although it started on March 25th, it wasn't finished until April 6th. Then there was an all-star film called Hurdy-Gurdy with Edgar Kennedy, Max Davidson, and Thelma Todd, which began on April 2nd and finished April 6th. And finally, the last film of the 4 series to begin was Charlie Chase in The Big Squawk, which was April 8th through 13th. And and then in release order, it was Unaccustomed as You Are was May 4th of 1929, Hurdy-Gurdy, May 11th, a week later, Small Talk a week after that, May 18th, and The Big Squawk a week after that, May 25th. So Laurel and Hardy got there first.
Yeah, that's right. I was looking at because I was quite interested in what the setup, the technical setup was in terms of the cameras, because I found that fascinating how they tried to develop quiet cameras, and I found a nice little informative piece in Thomas Benton Roberts' book, and he describes how what did he say? I've got it written down here. It says the old Bell and Howell cameras had to be quieted, so I had to make a blimp cover for them. A friend of mine, George Mitchell, came out with his silent camera, which was adopted by the industry at large. He later came out with a silent movement for the Bell and Howell camera. So it looks as though pretty much from the outset they were already, trying to quieten those cameras down. So I don't.
There is an article in American Cinematographer in 1929 by Len Powers, which I'm sure you've seen, where he's talking about working with Laurel and Hardy, and there are a couple of shots on location for the Hooskow. And if I remember correctly, there is already a Barney. A Barney was basically a padded blanket that went over the top of the camera, which is where the noise came from. It was the top where the magazine was, and a blimp is a metal encasement that you put over the camera. So a blimp is a bigger. In fact, you can see there is a still from Our Relations, which is taken from behind Rudolph Mattei and Harry Lockman. You see the camera, and you can see that the blimp has been moved up. Maybe they were changing a film magazine or something. But the blimp was a big metal thing that encased the camera, and a Barney was just a blanket. And I think they used the Barney more for exterior location footage because the noise was not, it was going to evaporate a bit into the open air. So it wasn't as much of a problem as it would be on an interior set. But they were, that was a problem they were working on. It's fascinating to go through the old trades sequentially because practically every month there's a new technological improvement.
Yeah,
there's an improvement in the film stock or the lights or something. Films from 1931 seem so much more advanced than films from 1929. And the whole industry was making technological improvements month by month by month. But Roach, I should mention here, I'm sure that when you were talking about these last silents, because you've been doing this sequentially, I imagine you talked about the synchronized scores
yes.
to some degree.
Yes.
Courier remembered doing that vividly because he went to Camden, New Jersey, where those were recorded. And they were done under the batons of several different people. There was Nat Shilkret did some. Nat Shilkret was sort of the guy overseeing all of the popular dance band music being issued on Victor Records. There was a man named Rosario Bourdon who did more classical pieces, and also Joseph Pasternak oversaw some of the sessions. And the first one was Habeas Corpus, which is October 6th of 28. So that would really mark the beginning of Hal Roach's entry into sound recording. And I don't know exactly when the crew came out from Camden to install the sound recording equipment. I suspect it was sometime very early in 1929, but there was a 10-day period between March 15th and March 25th where the studio was closed because they were installing the sound equipment. So
I think it was November. I think they arrived in November.
Yeah. Okay. And there are certainly several pictures of their arrival. And my good friend John Tefteller, who is a major savior of a lot of otherwise lost popular culture in phonograph records, but also in motion picture stills, he came across some stills that were in an envelope sent from Siegfried Cyriacus Baden, known as Sig Baden for obvious reasons. It was accompanied by a letter to his mother, and these were 8x10s of the sound crew arriving at the Roach Studios. And bless his heart, old Sig was nice enough to have attached on one of the stills a piece of paper which identified every one of the guys in the sound crew. So that's how we know who is who. So there were 6 guys who came out from Camden, New Jersey, from the Victor Talking Machine Company to essentially now live in Culver City. And they were joined by 3 local boys from Culver City, one of whom was Harvey Wasden, who I got to talk to because he came to several Way Out West meetings in the late 70s. But the crew was Elmer Regis, Sig Baden, B-A-D-E-N, James F. Green, whose name we will see in later credits, Jack Whitaker, Dip Neese, what an interesting name, Dip Neese, N-E-C-E, and John G. Harrison. So those were the guys from Camden. And then there was Harvey Wasden and 2 other boys who I don't know right now who were from Culver City. And that was the sound crew.
I've got the name of another one of the guys, actually. I'm assuming it's one of those from that period. Let me just dig through here.
There were some people later, too, during the strike of 1933. Because the soundmen went on strike in 33.
Yes. Here we go.
Harry Baker came in at that point.
Ralph Butler.
Oh, yeah. Well, Ralph Butler was there in the later 30s because he and Marvin Hatley were good friends. And in fact, one of the musical cues for Blockheads is called Ralph Butler's Stomp.
Oh, really? Okay.
I was going through the manuscript of that one day with Marvin, and I said, "What on earth is Ralph Butler's stomp?" And he said, "Ralph Butler was a mic monkey." he was the guy who oversaw the boom mic on the scoring stage. They had 35 musicians, and they basically were all covered by one microphone, I think. And so it was a boom mic, and he was the guy who would position the mic whenever, let's say, a string section had a particular passage to play. He'd move the mic more toward them, and then if the brass came in, then he'd move them more toward them. So he said, Ralph Butler was a mic monkey, and I just put that in there because when I called the tune, I just wanted to see his reaction. So unfortunately, I don't remember right now what tune that is, but maybe if I have it in the right order in Magic Behind the Movies, next time I watch Blockheads, I'll try and see which one it is, and then we'll know which one is Ralph Butler's stomp. But
that's great. Well, I think from what I can make out, I think Butler was there pretty much from the start. I mean, this is I mentioned to you. I mentioned to you Scott Iman's book, The Speed of Sound, and he mentions him in his book about how at the very start of the talkie era, there's a huge influx of guys with a little bit of technical knowledge. A lot of them came from the telephone companies, and some of them with a little bit of kind of radio experience. And he said the studios needed warm bodies. Their background was irrelevant. For example, Ralph Butler, a common labourer around the studios, got a lead to talk to a man who had just arrived in Hollywood from the Victor Talking Machine Company's headquarters in Camden, New Jersey. Butler was asked a few questions about basic electricity. He'd played around with crystal and single tube radios and was hired for $25 a week and assigned to the Hal Roach Studio. If a labourer could become a successful sound technician at $25 a week, a trained radio man could do much better.
Well,
so it sounds as if he was
probably Ralph Butler being part of the Culver City
the initial group.
Very good.
That was interesting.
Okay. Well, I know he was still there in 1938. So
it's great that. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that's really, really good. Do you want to talk a little bit about this sort of the importance of the transition to talkies? Obviously, I mean, we talk a lot about this, and we've mentioned it a few times on different episodes about that the failure of many stars to make that transition to talking pictures. And we compare Laurel and Hardy to Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton. I think Chaplin's a different case because obviously he stuck to his guns with the silent films.
Chaplin didn't make an actual talkie until The Great Dictator in 1940. And the irony of Chaplin is once he started talking, you couldn't get him to stop. You watch Limelight and you go, Charlie, that's the third inspirational speech you've given to the ballerina. One is enough. There's a great 90-minute movie hiding inside Limelight. Strip away about 35 or 40 minutes of it. I think he did fall in love with the sound of his voice once he did the speech in Great Dictator, which is an inspiring moment. But I think he was so lauded for it that he went, "Oh, I can talk now," and by golly, I will.
and went back and narrated all his old classics.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, in 42. The Gold Rush, where he tells us everything that we're seeing. A lot of that is superfluous. The little tramp is walking down the road. Yes, we can see that, Charlie. Thank you. You don't need
the little
to
fella.
Everything.
He's sad. That's
right.
Yeah. But it's interesting. I think it was Louise Brooks or Colleen Moore, I forget now, and she made a comment that the transition to talkies was kind of used as an excuse to get rid of highly paid stars, silent stars.
Well, yeah, especially in John Gilbert's case, because he had been a very, very, very high, probably the most highly paid person on the MGM roster. And he was already trouble anyway. He and Garbo had almost gotten married, and then Garbo stood him up. And I think during that unfortunate occurrence, I think he and Mayer had a fist fight. So, and this is well before talkies came in. So Gilbert was not Mayer's favorite employee. So there's always the story that they did something in the recording of Gilbert's voice to make it sound lighter than it was. And I don't know if that's possible. I do know that MGM, that Mayer specifically, did not want bass or high frequencies to be prominent in the sound mix. He wanted only the mid-range. He felt that the bass and the high end were a little too jarring for audiences, which is why when you hear early 30s movies from Warner Brothers or Paramount, they have these wonderful boom, there's presence, especially if you listen to Footlight Parade or 42nd Street or Gold Diggers of 1933. Boy, oh boy, that Warner Brothers orchestra is magnificently recorded, and you hear the full range of everything. And then you hear an MGM film from 1932 or 33, and it sounds wimpy because it's nothing but mid-range. And Douglas Shearer, who was the head of the sound department at MGM and who was also the brother of Norma Shearer, who was married to Irving Thalberg, he despaired of this because he knew that they could have recorded so much better. And it really isn't until Mayer was deposed in 1951 that you suddenly have the MGM musicals sounding so much better. So you have Singin' in the Rain in 1952 sounds terrific. The Bandwagon from 1953 sounds terrific. Well, why? Because Mayer wasn't there to say, get rid of the bass and get rid of the high end. Now, but as far as the silent era actors having problems with sound, well, you had a number of them who were from other countries. Emil Jannings was a major silent star, won an Oscar for Best Actor, but he had a very thick German accent, and so away he went, as did Nita Naldi and Pola Negri, and even some of the ladies who maybe had accents from Brooklyn or the Bronx. Evidently, Clara Bow worried about that, but if you see her talkies, she's terrific. She's absolutely great in Call Her Savage. Evidently, she was just terrified of the microphone, but nevertheless, in the 2 or 3 sound films she made, she's wonderful. It's a shame that she couldn't have continued. Norma Talmadge, I don't even know if she made a talkie, because she famously said to her sister Constance, she said, let's be thankful for the trust funds that Mama set up for us and get out. She wanted no part of talking films. There were directors who went by the wayside. One, of course, being Emmett Flynn, who directed Early to Bed with Laurel and Hardy. He had been a very prominent director in the early 20s, and maybe for reasons that were not related to talking films, he was gone by 1930. But Fred Niblo is another one who was a major director in the silent era, and you never hear of him in the talkie era. James Cruz. So yeah, and I think a lot of it also had to do with the beginning of 1930. It's a new decade. The same thing kind of happened in the collector's world with Super 8 films that we'd all been collecting furiously all through the mid and late 70s. And 1980, all of a sudden, it's now new decade. Now it's VHS. Now we're going to go to tape. We're going to go to home video. and Super 8 just died like that year, basically. So I think the fact that sound was coming in at the end of the 20s and the beginning of the 30s also had an effect of, let's wipe the slate clean and start all over with this new technology. And, in the case of Universal films, boy, they really wiped the slate clean because they made a big bonfire of all their silent films in storage and burned them. Which is why we don't have a good copy of Phantom of the Opera these days, or Hunchback of Notre Dame, because Junior Lemley said, we're not going to use those again. So they burned their legacy. So yeah, and there were several people who were casualties of talkies. We heard about John Gilbert. The saddest one, I think, is Carl Dane, who was part of a comedy team with George K. Arthur at MGM. And they'd made several feature films that they starred in the late 20s. Well, Carl Dane was Danish and had a very thick Danish accent and wound up making 2 or 3 films for Poverty Row Studios. But I think by about 1932, he was selling hot dogs outside the MGM gates at the studio where he'd been a star a few years before, and he committed suicide. I remember too, not just people involved in making the films, but all the musicians who had performed in theaters. You had orchestras, full orchestras in the big houses, and all of a sudden they were redundant. And so that was a real tragedy that all of those great musicians no longer had anywhere to play.
Yeah, even the mood musicians on the
Yeah,
set for
yes.
the silence, they were out of work all of a sudden as
Right.
well.
Yeah. Well, yes. In Singing in the Rain, that's Donald O'Connor's job. And then
Oh yeah, of
when
course.
talkies come in, happily the studio chief makes him the head of the music department. They say, well, we're going to need music in these films, so Cosmo, you're the head of the music department. Oh, great, great. And of course, Marvin Hatley came in because he worked at the radio station at the Roach lot, KFVD, which happily had its studios at the Roach Studios, and because he was part of the very versatile, happy-go-lucky trio, why he's elected. He became the music guy for them because he could play any instrument and could read and write music, and so there you go. So yeah, it really was an upheaval because, of course, this was all happening at the time of the stock market crash. I just, it's amazing that so many exhibitors survived because they had to install this. They had to install speakers. They had to install the new projection equipment and wiring. And this is at the time when the economy is taking a decided downturn, and still nobody really knew how long sound was going to last. It might have been something like 3D later on, which basically was big news for 1953 and was gone by 1954. So who knew? So it was really a time of upheaval in the industry. But Laurel and Hardy and Hal Roach, they attacked that problem head on, and they did a great job, really. If you look at the other three of the first or the other Roach films, Small Talk, which is the first Our Gang film, and The Big Squawk, which is the first Charlie Chase, and somewhere I do have a copy of Hurdy-Gurdy, but I wasn't able to find it. But Unaccustomed As We Are is by far the smoothest and the most entertaining and the least creaky of those early talkies. Again, I think Laurel and Hardy, just that they had demonstrated a visual and physical rapport with each other almost from the very get-go with Duck Soup, they had a rapport in dialogue. And they knew how to write dialogue for those characters. Stan's first line is "Any nuts," which right. They weren't trying to be snappy, stand-up comics. They weren't trying to do one-liners. They spoke naturally. Very probably they improvised a lot of their own dialogue. And as I say, everybody in that film, in Unaccustomed As We Are, is a very, very good vocal performer.
Yes, yeah. It's like in, I always think about Wrong Again. They have some real long conversations in Wrong Again. So they've been doing it already, haven't they?
Yeah, that film,
building that rapport.
That really is like a talkie, but without the soundtrack. Because there was that whole scene where they were sitting on the couch and they talk with each other with no title cards, and yet you know what they're saying. Well, that's McCary for you. McCary loved long takes where not too much happens. That's where you can really see the influence of a director, which is fairly rare in Hal Roach comedies.
Yes, yeah, and we have quite a stark contrast with Harold Lloyd's early talkies. They were very his character just didn't match who you thought he was. In the silent films, he was very sort of brash and a bit kind of cocky and wise guy.
Yeah, well, particularly in Welcome Danger, which he had shot as a silent, and then went and saw some sort of sound comedy. And he said they were laughing at the punkest gags just because they could hear things. And so he went back and reshot a lot of material and put in a lot of jokey dialogue, which isn't what you would have anticipated. And also, it's about the silent clowns. I remember being surprised the first time I heard Buster Keaton's voice.
Yeah,
it was deeper than I thought it would be.
That's right. Yeah.
But now, having gotten used to it, I think it fits.
Yeah.
It's sort of flat like his hat.
That's right. Yeah.
Buster, when he's doing interviews, he has sort of a Midwestern twang to his voice like that.
That's right.
I was born on a one-night stand in Kansas, a little town called Pickaway, and he sounds like a Midwesterner, which you kind of think that Buster would be.
Yeah.
Even though I'm sure he had no memories of Pickaway, Kansas, because his family was on the road constantly, but just happened to be where he was born.
Yeah.
But it seems like an appropriate place for Buster Keaton to be born.
Yes, yeah. I mean,
So-
talking of Buster, I mean, he probably had some of the worst luck of all of them. I mean, Buster's, he had the change, of course, to MGM taking control of his films right at the point where talkies are coming in as well. So he's got a double-edged sword on that one.
And he was very enthusiastic about doing sound films.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was not afraid of sound at all. You know, Keaton's character embraces new technology. So Keaton himself, if you think of all the things that he did visually with Sherlock Jr. or with the Playhouse, you know, there's a chorus line of 9 Buster Keatons all in sync.
Yes, that's right.
New technology was always a happy challenge for him.
Yeah.
And he had wanted to do a talkie Western with Marie Dressler. And he went to Thalberg with this idea. And he said, you know, just the two of us, we'll figure out what to say. He says, you know, when you fall down and go boom, you hear you going boom. And so that's all the sound we need. We don't need to do all sorts of jokes and dialogue and all that stuff.
That's right.
And so if Keaton had gotten more of his own way, he was successful in those films, at least financially.
Yeah.
Those MGM films, which we rather despair of, made a pile of money. They made a lot more money than the last 3 classic Keaton productions, which had the misfortune to be distributed by United Artists, which had no theaters. And, you know, that was the problem. It wasn't that they were not successful, it's that they just couldn't get any screens. So, had Keaton gotten his own way, he might well have made 4 or 5 early 30s classics.
Yeah.
But
I feel really sorry for Buster.
Yeah, it wasn't sound so much as material, and a misguided use of his talents.
Yeah,
so.
and the sort of the lack of control of it. I was reading James Curtis's brilliant book on Buster Keaton, and Buster had the right idea, and just using, like Laurel and Hardy do, using dialogue very sparingly, keep the physical comedy. But they just wouldn't allow him to do it. They took all the control off him, you know, as happened in the 40s for Laurel and Hardy, I guess. Yeah. Such a shame for him, but there we go.
But Laurel and Hardy always found a way to use dialogue when it was needed, and they found ways to use it in a very funny way. I mean, we have the "Tell Me That Again"
yes,
scene.
That's right.
We have Ollie and Stan's catchphrases. You know, we have Stan, you know, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
It certainly is.
Yes.
But they sound like things that someone would say naturally. As far as, here's another nice mess you've gotten me into. They sort of fell in love with that one because it shows up for the first time in Murder Case, and it shows up again in Pardon Us and Another Fine Mess, which are the films that were made right after that. So they kind of went, that's a good phrase. Let's, they sort of intentionally made that one a well-known phrase. But you know, there are wonderful scenes where, like in the Them Hills, when they're preparing the lunch and they're doing the old spinning wheel with Pum Pum.
Yeah.
You know, that's not exactly dialogue, but it's a very funny vocal accompaniment to visual comedy, and it never seems intrusive. Every once in a while there will be an out and out joke that doesn't work, like for example in Another Fine Mess, Ollie says, oh, they're twins, one was born in LA and the other in Miami. And Lord Plumtree says, I don't quite understand, and Ollie says, oh, that's all right, neither do they. Well, that's kind of a hokey vaudeville type joke, you know.
Right.
And happily, there are very few of those in Laurel and Hardy. I think that must have been something that Beanie Walker threw in. If you ever read the dialogue-only scripts that Beanie Walker wrote, he did not have the knack of writing Laurel and Hardy dialogue. He wrote wonderful titles, but he tended to write dialogue that was too flowery or just did not sound natural.
Yeah.
And you know, Dorothy Granger said, no, we always had the leeway to say it in our own words at Roach's. And so that's a blessing that, you know, Roach always had the attitude that 50% of what's in the script will not play, and, you know, say it how it feels natural to you. And speaking of Mr. Roach, you know, there's that great story he used to tell about the first time that they were showing dailies of a film that he had directed, which might have been Hurdy-Gurdy, I think. And so they're in the projection room and everybody's there and they're watching these scenes, and the first shot comes on And at the end of the take, there's a voice from off screen that says, "That's good." And then another one comes on, and this voice goes, "That's good." And after 3 or 4 of this, Roach says, "Wait a minute, stop the projection machine. Hang on a minute. Now, wait a minute. I'm the head of this studio. I'm the guy who's going to decide whether or not something's good. Who the hell is it who keeps saying that's good?" And finally, a little script girl says, "Mr. Roach, that's you."
Yeah, that's great, isn't it?
He hadn't realized that was his own voice, or that he said "that's good" at the end of every take.
Brilliant.
So,
I love it.
and of course, Roach also said, some of the best stuff we ever shot we couldn't use because people broke up with laughter.
Yeah.
And he said that's the only thing that made me mad was some of the very best stuff we shot couldn't be used in the picture. Well, it's too bad that they couldn't have gotten William Terhune, which was usually the sound editor. They couldn't have got him to do a slug and cover up the offending laughter from behind the camera.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So,
yeah, it must have been such a shame to take all that away from as you say, for performers as well, to lose that laughter on stage.
Yeah.
It's enough to make a man burst out crying.
Oh, I was going to ask you about the music. We just talked very briefly about the music. Because obviously we still don't have the cuckoo song at the start, even though we're in the talkie period.
Yeah.
Is there
the theme music on Unaccustomed As We Are was actually lifted from the music track that had been made for Liberty.
That's right.
It's the same main title music.
Yes.
That was available. I think I'm not sure if it's on the first Our Gang film, but the Our Gang comedies. What do they start with? That Old Gang of Mine. Da, 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 that old gang of mine, which was, kind of a logical tune to have for Our Gang. But yeah, the cuckoo song doesn't come in until Night Owls. So there's still several films that just have sort of generic theme music, and mostly taken from the synchronized scores that they had made for those last few silent pictures.
So these early talkies weren't as kind of, the soundtrack wasn't as designed, let's say, as the synchronized silence. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, they didn't start using background music at all, I don't think, until, is it Hog Wild? No, they were using just popular tunes of the time, because the original track for Blotto and the original track for Bratz use popular songs of the time.
Right.
And I think Hog Wild is where they start using their own tunes written by Alice K. Howlett and Will Livernash. They have Smile When the Raindrops Fall and Golfer's Blues, which you can also hear Charlie Chase sing in some of his early talkies. And then before long, they've got Leroy Shield coming in and writing all those great cues that we love so much that were used for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
And he's another person who came in with the Victor Talking Machine Company as Regis. I don't know. I think he came along a little bit later, but Victor at the time did not have a West Coast studio. And once Roach was installed there, they said, well, heck, let's make records of the West Coast bands. And that's when Shield came in to supervise those sessions. And so that's why we have all those great records by Gus Arnheim's band from 1929, 30, 31, made out here in Southern California. And I'm quite sure that it's mainly Gus Arnheim's orchestra that plays the cues that we love in the Hal Roach movies. They're never credited in the payrolls, unfortunately, because I think they were paid through the American Federation of Musicians. So if there's payrolls from them, from the same period, maybe we can figure out who played what. But when you hear Gus Arnheim records from that time, they sound very much like the Roach Band. And there are Victor ledgers for one of the Charlie Chase films, which says orchestra conducted by Mr. Arnheim and Mr. Shield.
Ah, okay.
So there was very definitely some participation by the Gus Arnheim Orchestra in doing the musical cues.
Yeah.
So
we'll have to look at the music of the Roach films a little bit more in depth. Perhaps we'll do a bonus podcast, I think, on that. If you'd be up for something like that, Randy, that would be
sure. That'd
be lovely. Especially with your connection to Marvin.
Yes,
it would be.
I wrote a couple of articles of that around that for the one of John Tefteller's books, the Laurel and Hardy. On radio and on the phone.
Yeah, of course.
There's some articles about the music there.
Yes. And you wrote a lovely one for the first issue of our Laurel and Hardy magazine, of course, on Marvin. That was a really nice article.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, he was a very special person to me.
Yes, no, you could tell. That's great. So, yeah, just bringing it right back to the action on screen. I remember we talked about the voices, and I chatted with Bill Cassara about Edgar Kennedy, and I remember he was talking about Kennedy's voice in particular sounded very soft compared to what you would imagine his voice to be. So I think he had to do a little bit of work on it. It was very softly spoken, Edgar Kennedy.
I like the shot where he is consoling Mae Bush.
Yes, that's what I was thinking
and
of.
He's saying, no, now I'm giving the boys a good talking to.
Mrs. Hardy. Stop that crying. Now, I'm going to take the boys outside and give them a good talking to. You go out to the kitchen and fix them up a nice little supper. I'll have them back here in 5 minutes for you.
No. Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Kennedy.
That's perfectly all right, Mrs. Hardy. Here. You bozos, take this trunk and put it over in my apartment.
And that's how that should be played.
Yeah.
And fortunately, the microphones were able to pick up that low volume acting. You didn't have to shout from the rooftops, you know.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is if you see the Spanish version of Night Owl's Ladrones, Kennedy is speaking Spanish, and he's focusing so much on saying the words properly that the nuances of his performance sort of go out the window.
I can imagine.
It's when you see the English language version, it's a wonderful performance, and he's don't worry, Kennedy will fix it. In the Spanish version, it's all sort of shouted like this because he's just wanting to make sure that he says everything properly. So he had an extra hurdle to deal with there in his performance. But that was one thing that struck me again watching the film again yesterday was that particular shot. Well, of course, Mae Bush vocally is terrific all through it.
Yeah.
She has a voice that records well.
Yeah.
For one thing, she has that sort of strident bark. She's not going to be lost. You're going to hear everything she says, even when she and Ollie are all talking at the same time. You hear her more prominently than you do him.
You do.
And but Edgar gives a very nuanced performance. That scene, and also the scene where he's talking to the boys and confiding in them, where hey, you guys, if you're gonna fool around, you got to be more careful about it. You should see the girls I see on my beat.
Yes.
Now you guys go away, and I'll deal with this cluck in the trunk. So he once again he performs it as the scene would call for, and happily the sound recording equipment was able to deal with it, and he didn't have to project more than you would really want him to do in the scene. And Thelma Todd is very good too.
So, little Dicky Bird is waiting.
Well, you don't understand it, dear.
I'm a clock, am I? Well, listen. You get a bit of my technique, dearie.
This is her first film for Roach. She signed a 5-year contract, which included a deal to make records for Victor, but unfortunately, beyond a couple of test records that she made with Eddie Dunn, whom we know from Me and My Pal and other Laurel and Hardy films.
Yes,
they made a couple of duet records, but that's as far as it got. They were never released.
Singing records, you mean? Actually, singing.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
But I've always wondered what the deal was with Thelma Todd, because right before this, she had been starring in some feature films that were sort of comedy mystery films. She made 3 of them for a director named Christensen, and Seven Footsteps to Satan, I think, is one of them. And but starring in silent or part talking features, and then she signs on to do support work in two-reelers. Well, that would seem to me to be not a career progression, and I don't know if there was anything that happened that would cause her to have a demotion in stature. But anyway, we're glad that she signed on with Roach, because I think the films for which she is most fondly remembered are the Roach films, and also Horse Feathers and Monkey Business with the Marx Brothers. But so, we're we're glad things played out as they did in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm going to try and do some more bonus episodes looking at Thelma Todd and Mae Bush especially. As we go along a little bit. So it'd be good to dig into the careers and the backgrounds, because I know Thelma was from Massachusetts, born in 1906, and she was a school teacher originally. Yeah, which is
she just happened to win a beauty contest, and that
that
put her on the path to Hollywood. And of course, Mae was from Melbourne, Australia, and born into a theatrical family that was usually on the road, so that's why most of her childhood was spent in a convent, which is maybe not where you would anticipate Mae Bush growing up.
Not really, no.
But, Annie Mae Bush was her name. And and she's in, there's a period there later on in 32 through 34 where she's in a lot of Laurel and Hardy films. The only one, there's a whole run of them where she's in every one except for Babes in Toyland. The only other Roach company that she worked with, there's One Hour Gang film. I think she's in Fly My Kite. Otherwise, the only people she worked with at Roach were Laurel and Hardy, and I don't know if she was thought to be persona non grata or what. A lot of people still resented her for breaking up Mabel Normand and Max Sennett.
That's right.
That could have been the reason. But anyway, she still had magnificent talent. So
she's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely superb. And as with Stan and Babe, you're talking about her voice. She has one of those voices that really does match the character that you can see. Yeah, fantastic. Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, all the Laurel and Hardy supporting players have very good voices, and they match. I mean, Charlie Hall and Walter Long and Anita Garvin and Tiny Sanford. They sound like what you would anticipate.
Yeah, and Finlayson, don't forget.
Yes, of course. And I would imagine that Stan's Ulverston accent probably was a surprise to some people.
Yeah.
They probably weren't anticipating that. And yet it works perfectly. They never make a big deal of him being from England. Really, the only direct reference to it, I think, is in Way Out West, where he says, south of London.
South of London,
which is not where he's from at all, but, okay. And the fish and chips, there they directly reference his British background.
Yeah.
But I think that helped with the deliberateness of the way that he delivers dialogue. Laurel and Hardy they don't mumble. Everything is perfectly enunciated, and everything is made very clear with gestures, and they get the point across.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Stan, that's a good idea. It certainly is. It works with the idea of them being sort of shabby gentlemen.
Yes.
But still having this, even though they keep doing the wrong thing, they still have a sort of innate dignity.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
And I think the English accent helped to convey that. So.
Yeah, I think especially that sort of the contrast between. I mean, we talk about the fat one and the thin one, and obviously you've got Ollie's voice is very rich and that lovely southern accent that he has, and it's great for the genteel side, but also the pomposity that he brings. It's absolutely perfect. But with Stan, because he has that English accent, it's a lovely contrast. But also it adds to that kind of almost otherworldly feel that Stan has at times. You know what I mean? It's not part of that American world. It's a different thing altogether, and it just makes him even more lovable having that voice. Yeah. It's just brilliant.
Yeah, and Hardy had a very musical speaking voice.
Yes, yeah.
He loved music and sang professionally in Jacksonville and sang in vaudeville. And of course, one of his great memories as a child was going to see Caruso in Atlanta. So music was always a great passion of his. And I'm sure he did not take any lessons from the vocal coaches who began springing up in Hollywood around 1928 and 29, as is parodied in Singing in the Rain, when you have Kathleen Freeman trying in vain to teach Lena Lamont how to speak properly. I don't think Hardy needed it. He enunciated well, and the inflections are beautiful. It's just a beautiful silken voice. Of course, I was surprised as a kid to hear him say Boyd and Woyd. And before I knew better, I assumed that he was from New York, because that's the only place where I knew where people would say Boyd and Woyd instead of Bird and Word.
Yes, that's right.
But I guess people from Georgia did that as well. But anyway, the voices were there right from the beginning.
Yeah, it'd be lovely to know from their own, from their own mouths how nervous they were about it. I mean, as you say, Babe must have been fairly confident. He has such a lovely voice, and it seems as though it was only Stan really that had the.
Stan supposedly was quite nervous about it, and I forget if it was Courier or who, but somebody said he wanted to hear a playback on every take.
That's right,
and he was concerned about his S's being a little sibilant. As you know, he didn't have the greatest teeth in the world, and so that I think that it caused his S's to be a little mushy sounding. But everybody's S's were mushy sounding at that point because of the recording technology. And I think we mentioned Anita Garvin lisping all over the place, and then realizing everybody was lisping all over the place. So clearly, they weren't paralyzed by the coming of sound, and the reaction to the sound films was so positive right at the beginning that they knew that they had to continue making them. In fact, that's another thing that I found. Let's see, the Motion Picture News. Let's see if I can bring this up. This is from April 27th, 1929. It's on the front cover of the Motion Picture News and says, "Look who is talking. Hal Roach's first all-dialogue comedy. The funniest picture you ever played. Get ready. Releases May 4th." And it says, now Stan Laurel, Oliver Hardy, and Unaccustomed As We Are, now playing with $2 engagement of Broadway Melody at Columbia Theater, San Francisco. So that is evidently in advance of the official release date of May 4th.
Right.
So that must have been where it premiered. It would have been the Columbia Theater in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And of course, $2 in 1929 is a significant amount of money to pay to see a movie.
Yeah.
But I did find some reviews, and they were all very, very, very positive. So, that, of course, would be the encouragement for them to continue making more talkies, which they did. I mean, how many talkies did they have by the time that 1929 was over? 6 or 7 of them? They made them very quickly, and a lot of them are very good. Men of War and Perfect Day, and Huskow is a terrific picture. And also that one, technically, in fact, that's one I would like to do when you get ready to do that one, because what's interesting is They Go Boom, which is right before it, I think, is all pretty much on 2 rather cramped little sets. And I think they saved the money on that one so they could spend it on Huskow, because Huskow is entirely shot outdoors, which brings up a whole new set of technical hurdles to circumvent. And which they do. I mean, there are tracking shots and crane shots and all sorts of great things in Huskow. It's a very visually fluid movie for being that early in the sound period. So Laurel and Hardy, they dealt with the challenge of sound, and they met it very, very well. Really better than any of the comedians that had been working alongside of them in the late 20s.
Yeah, I find that really interesting as well. How as you would expect, I guess, the first film, Unaccustomed As We Are, is all interior shots. So a very controlled environment. But then immediately, the second one, Birthmarks, you're outdoors. You're in a busy train. It's like they just thought, let's go for it. Let's just do it. Let's see what happens.
And that was shot concurrently with the second Our Gang talkie, which is Railroadin'.
Ah, yes.
Which also has scenes taken probably at the same time.
Yeah.
Because there are parallel shooting dates.
Yeah.
They probably went to that location and had both storylines and said, okay, let's get these shots for Laurel and Hardy, and then we'll get these other shots, because there's a lot of outdoor shots in Railroadin' also.
Yeah.
I think they wanted the novelty of movies with actual sound of what you would hear outside.
That's right.
And they were able, technically, probably thanks to Regis and the crew, to figure out how to do it. So yeah, they again, Hal Roach was not a guy who shied away from a challenge.
No, absolutely not. No, that's right. And all this, is I mean, certainly as I research more and more and find out more about how different studios were doing it and the different challenges, and it just makes you realize just what a fantastic place the Roach Studio was, and how Roach allowed them to develop, and he gave everybody the space, and he let them show their talents, and whether they're behind the scenes or behind the cameras or in front of the cameras. It was all of just a fantastic melting pot that just produced such wonderful stuff.
Yeah, I admire him for basically saying, I hired talented people and then let them alone.
Yeah.
Because if they weren't good without my supervision, they didn't deserve to be there in the first place. He said, I would criticize the hell out of the dailies, but not on the set. I didn't feel that was right, because they would freeze up if the big boss was on the set. And he said, I had faith in the people that I hired. And so that's great administrative philosophy number one, which David O. Selznick was not that way. David O. Selznick micromanaged every shot of every film that he ever produced. There's volumes of memos that he wrote every day that go on and on forever, criticizing everything. And the other thing, of course, is Roach's philosophy that 50% of the script will not play. That was just, even though you'd worked hard to make this script and thought that you had a great story, once you got it up in front of the cameras, maybe it wasn't as funny as you thought it would be. And that was just an assumption that, that's why we have gag men here as we're shooting, to come up with something better. And maybe the props, the actual set and the props suggest things that are better. That's certainly the case with Tit for Tat, which you can read in Laurel and Hardy scripts, the first volume. It's a terrible script. and there's actually a letter from Stan where he says, yeah, that one we made up while we went along, and it was it's surprising that it wound up as good as it was.
It's great. Yeah, it is great. Wonderful. Well, we've got all these fantastic films still to come. I mean, it's. I can't wait to get into it. I've got you down for the Hooskow, Randy. Okay. And I'm sure we'll see you before then.
Good as the silence are, the best is still yet to come.
Absolutely right. I'm into that. Randy, unless you have anything else you'd like to impart.
I think just like the ruler, we are exhausted.
Very good, sir.
I think we've covered the topic pretty well.
I think so. Brilliant. Thank you for spending this time with us again, Randy. It's always a treat. And
all right, Patrick.
If anybody wants more information on Unaccustomed As We Are, I direct them straight to The Magic Behind the Movies, which is available pretty much where all good books are available.
Well, it's available mainly on Amazon because they print it.
That's it then.
And we went with Amazon because that's the only way we could get it distributed all around the world without having to pay exorbitant postage costs from Southern California.
Yeah.
So Amazon has the lock on that title, but happily you can get it all over the world from Amazon.
Fantastic. Randy, thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and we will see you again very, very soon.
All right. Thank you very much.
On the Laurel and Hardy podcast, we are blessed with an array of wonderful guests, and one of the things I love is that I'm always able to learn new nuggets of information about the Laurel and Hardy world, and I know that today is going to be no different. In fact, our next guest doesn't just provide nuggets of gold, he has the deeds to a goldmine of information. Yes, we're welcoming Richard Bann back to the show to help us to shed some light on a person of considerable importance in our deep dive into Unaccustomed As We Are. So, Richard, welcome back to the Laurel and Hardy podcast.
Thank you, Patrick. And at the outset of this meeting, I think we should say something about the computer issues we've been having trying to launch and sustain this Zoom get-together. And I have to laugh because even in the real world, Laurel and Hardy have often scripted our lives, because when you got up to find out if your kids elsewhere in the house there were mitigating with the bandwidth because it's late in the day in England, I imagine you walking into their bedroom and saying, "Will you kids stop your playing and go to sleep?"
Exactly.
So anyway, today we're going to talk about Unaccustomed As We Are, and I mean this only as a cameo appearance, just to add the voice of Lou Foster, which you're not going to hear anywhere else because he was never interviewed by anyone else.
Yeah.
And the best material from Lou Foster will be found in the Men of War book when it's finished. But I want to share some of the things he said concerning Unaccustomed As We Are and the coming of sound with that picture. And
That sounds swell to me.
I think it's good too.
Yes, sir.
first, about Lou Foster, this is from the Men of War text, quote, Lou Foster was a writer his entire career. Originally a newspaperman in San Francisco, trained in journalism at the University of California, Louis R. Foster began at the studio in 1921 as a laborer and successfully worked his way up through every department in the Roach organization. He was a prop man on both Grandma's Boy, 1922, and Safety Last the following year with Harold Lloyd. He graduated to dressing sets, then the casting office, then assistant director, then production assistant to F. Richard Jones, who I know you like.
Yep, certainly do.
And when Jones left to direct Douglas Fairbanks in The Gaucho, 1928, he asked Roach for Foster as his assistant director on a loan-out basis. Then back on the Lot of Fun, Foster finally joined the scenario department, attaining the status of gag man, then writer, then director on the Charlie Chase, Laurel and Hardy, and Harry Langdon companies. And as we know, he directed the last 3 Laurel and Hardy Silents and their first 3 Talkers. What had cemented his status at the Roach plant was one key assignment, salvaging Charlie Chase's movie night, which had been shelved for quite some time. No one else knew how to fix it, not even McCary and Chase, but Foster did, which is saying something. For George Stevens in 1943, he penned the scenario of The More the Merrier, for which Foster was Oscar nominated. And he continued on as a prolific writer-director in Hollywood. Late in his career, Lou Foster wrote and directed a lot of television programming, especially for Walt Disney, whom he admired, he said, even more than Hal Roach. So that's from the Men of War text. And then these then are the words of Lou Foster from, dear God, over 50 years ago about making movies on the Lot of Fun. Quote, Roach's original idea would land on us, and we would try to develop it and follow through, adding gags as they might arise organically. If we veered into a different direction and he liked it, fine. If he didn't, that wasn't good. Eventually, we'd have a little script, the action script, a rough guide, and he'd sign off on it. Of course, you'd want to enlist enthusiastic support from both Roach and Stan. Then on location during mornings, we'd block out the scenes, rehearse and try out the gags to see if they worked. Lots of the time, they didn't. That's where Stan came in. He generally knew how to help fix any situation or make it better. His mind was gifted for invention, always turning, and he was always up for fun, for great gags. He lived for that. He really did. Babe Hardy's contribution was as a performing artist. The things he did, the florid gestures, they were all of his own personality, and he had no peer. You see the play of emotions on this guy's face. He was a real actor, a pure natural. What Babe did in front of a motion picture camera, what you got from him was the gold standard. Most of the time, he was happy-go-lucky and left most of the worrying to Stan. Some of us thought, well, Babe could have partnered with any number of others, whereas Stan would not have worked nearly as well with anyone else or on his own. Between takes, Babe would go off in a corner, have a cigarette, play some instrument, leaving Stan as a worrywart, figuring the next scenes with me, always suggesting, nicely, always inventing. He would start laughing hysterically, and you knew he had thought of a gag that was killing him. And after you said, it stinks, he would laugh just as hard, end quote.
That's great.
More from the Men of War text. So talking pictures arrive. Now, this is not Foster speaking. This is my comments from the Men of War text. So talking pictures arrive. Hal Roach never hesitated on getting sound. He went right after it as soon as he could, as soon as it was practical, as soon as the technical aspects had been conquered under his guidance and supervision. But Roach's real genius was in subverting sound to the visual style of the comedies he was making. Sound was intended only as an adjunct to his visual comedy style, not as a substitute for any part of it. Even when talking pictures came in, he tried to tell his people he didn't want them emphasizing sound effects and dialogue or jokes instead of visual gags the way others were doing. And more from Lou Foster, quote, "On my first talkie, Unaccustomed As We Are, we were working at night because we did not have sufficient recording equipment right away. There was only enough for one company. We had to share, you know? And the same stage, too. The gang, Bob McGowan's our gang, they were kids, they couldn't work at night, so we only got the equipment for sound that we needed when they were finished for the day. We took about 3 weeks on that first talking picture for what we thought was possibly going to be a three-reeler, as everything was new. The sound men tried to make a mystery of sound, and our camera was enclosed with cameraman and director in a huge sweat box that had no ventilation, no air vents, and was moved about by laborers with crowbars. It was hot as hell inside this enclosure. You'd be sweltering, but we had to make the cameras soundproof. And George Stevens wasn't the only cameraman on that picture. We needed 4 of them. But it was exciting those days. You had to be inventive every minute. Roach was a small studio, to be sure, but we had a lot of bright people there, I can tell you that. It took less than a year, but we pretty quickly made the necessary adjustments. Silent cameras were not silent. They made a grinding noise. New, quieter cameras were quickly rebuilt so we could get rid of those soundproof booths. You couldn't breathe in there. And you could move around with a portable camera, but not those damn booths. So since the camera couldn't move, neither could the actors. And we're supposed to be making motion pictures. But that's why we started out using multiple cameras positioned differently, you know, for coverage and pacing. So recording talking pictures imposed heavy restrictions we were not used to. Old methods had to be discarded. None of us much liked that these new sound men with their earphones were giving out the orders. And before we had sound booms for microphones, actors had to be careful not to say anything unless they were close enough to wherever we had hidden the mic so as to pick up their dialogue. At first, that was tricky for everyone, especially Babe Hardy, as to how loud he should be speaking, depending on the scene and where the mic was. As for dialogue, we had to wrestle with that too. Before 1929, actors never had to memorize lines. That's another reason the big studios brought in stage actors from Broadway, because they could both memorize and deliver lines. We didn't do that, but the big guns did. Another thing, we'd been making what today they call silent films. Now suddenly we're making sound films on a set which was completely silent. Directors couldn't bark out suggestions anymore. Carpenters hammering on new sets had to stop, and so on. You see? This was a new experience for everyone. People at other studios were destroyed by the revolution that took place. And for some, I mean their careers and lives were destroyed, end quote. Then from another section in the book, Lou Foster says this about working with Thelma Todd on Unaccustomed As We Are, quote, "They hid mics in flowers and telephone receivers," he said, "even in Thelma Todd's bosom. Her voice was not strong so that you could pick up dialogue. At least we thought we had to do that, but experience soon taught us that we didn't. We found out that we could tie a mic to a long bamboo pole, light enough for a man to carry, and you could pick up sound all over the set. We used the same process extensively outside on Men of War. Moving poles or booms were just a little more trouble for the cameramen, among whom were Roach and Stevens, as this equipment made moving shadows. By the way, I lived across the hall from Thelma at the Highborn Gardens apartment for a long time. I'm going to end the quote here just to say these Highborn Garden apartments, this was not far from what is now the famous but touristy intersection of Hollywood and Highland, where they staged the Oscar ceremonies today. Hollywood is a slum. Nobody goes there except for things like the Oscar ceremonies, but that's where this was. So then Lou Foster continues, and I had many a pleasant talk with her at leisure moments, sort of like you see in that picture, come to think of it. She was, to the best of my knowledge, a very nice, refined person. I never believed she committed suicide. She loved life too much. I think she was done in, end quote. So anyway, Unaccustomed As We Are, one of the very important theaters in LA was the Fox Carthay Circle Theater, and it's gone now. And I've been to the site of where it was because it was such an important theater. Now, I'm on the east side of Beverly Hills at the border, and this magnificent movie palace was about 2 miles southeast of here. Lou Foster sent me a Xerox of a fold-out souvenir program for a big premiere that was staged there, which he attended, and presumably so did Laurel and Hardy, but it's only a guess. I don't know that they were there or not, but I can read the highlights of this brochure. Here's what it says. Fox Carthay Circle Theater, Los Angeles, California. Program 1, Fox Movie Tone News. It speaks for itself. 2, Hal Roach presents his first all-dialogue comedy, Unaccustomed As We Are, with Stan Laurel, Oliver Hardy, Mae Bush, Edgar Kennedy, Thelma Todd, directed by Louis R. Foster, and they misspell his name. And then the last thing they say, well, Western Electric System. Then they say, Master of Ceremonies for this exciting event, Mr. Walter Catlett, famous New York comedy star. Mr. Catlett will introduce members of the cast of The Black Watch at the conclusion of the performance tonight. And Patrick, do you know who Walter Catlett was?
I don't. No, it's a new name to me, that one.
Okay, he was a Broadway comedian, and he starred in 2 real shorts for both Columbia and RKO, but he was also in big features like the 2 that I know of are Bringing Up Baby and Yankee Doodle Dandy. So he was a name. He was an important name. Right. So he was the MC that night.
Oh, okay.
So and again, I don't know if Laurel and Hardy were there or not. Another thing, Mr. Foster sent me Xeroxes of favorable reviews for his pictures, but of course I presume they were all favorable or he wouldn't have sent them to me. But here's a part of one of them from what publication, I don't know. It's just a clipping, but the reviewer is named Kingston, and it says of Laurel and Hardy, quote, both stars are trained comedians of the stage, and the result is that their talking business is fully as good as they made the business in the silence formerly produced. We are happy to think that the boys will lose none of their former humor in the talkies. If anything, as time goes on and the makers become acquainted with the possibilities of the talkies, you can gamble that the Laurel-Hardys will remain the best of the 2 real comedies, end quote. And then the critique praises Foster, too.
Very good.
So when I worked at the Easton Phelan Corporation, we carried Unaccustomed As We Are in the Black Hawk Bulletin as a silent film for sale to 8mm and 16mm collectors. Because at that point, no one could find the soundtracks. And previously, both Unaccustomed As We Are and They Go Boom were never in the TV syndication packages during the 1950s and 1960s because they were considered to be lost films at that time.
Right.
And it was my old friend Sam Sherman of Independent International Pictures, whom I just spoke to about this, who long ago found suitable preprint for both subjects. Without Sam, we wouldn't have these pictures today.
Wow.
At least what he found was the picture portion. And I've spoken before about another old friend of mine, Herb Gelspan of Hal Roach Studios. He was then officing in New York for Hal Roach Studios. And I love this guy, but he never spent any time rooting around random film labs or storage facilities around the world searching for lost film elements. There was a period, though, when Herb was still in New York, when he hired the young Sam Sherman, who's even older than I am, to search for film elements. And Sam, incidentally, he would make trips to LA from New York to meet old film favorites that he would interview. And they would later appear in the awful drive-in movies that he produced, scores of them, like Blazing Stewardess is the one that everybody talks about. It's a terrible drive-in movie. Anyway, that's Sam. So he found these 35 millimeter elements for both these lost Laurel and Hardy titles, and he found them at Lloyd's Storage out on Long Island, New York. They'd probably still be lost if not for Sam Sherman's diligent sleuthing. So then he carried the film cans back to the city. He went up to Herb Gelbspann's office, Hal Roach Studios, East Coast office on 57th Street in Midtown, and he placed everything on Herb's desk. This was nitrate film. Well, weeks later, Sam came back only to find the precious and long missing and dangerous nitrate film elements for Unaccustomed As We Are and They Go Boom. They were still sitting right there on Herb's desk. So you wonder, what if the sun had come in through a window and heated up those film cans? Why were they still sitting there? And the answer is, this was Herb's answer, quote, "We just don't have any money," meaning to do anything with them, to transfer them, standards conversion for different media and then licensing for TV and non-theatrical. And Herb was really the one who kept Hal Roach Studios going after the company emerged from bankruptcy in 1967. But funding any activity, any productivity was always difficult. He used to say, I heard him say this many times, bankruptcy really hurt this corporation. It was Ken Easton, my old boss of Blackhawk Films, who advanced the money for the standards conversion to safety film, and he did so against royalties that he would eventually owe on sales in the non-theatrical library and home use market where Blackhawk Films functioned. But that was only the action, the picture without the track. And where were the discs? Where's the sound? I don't know if you know about, Patrick, do you know about the series called Laurel and Hardy's Laugh Tunes?
Yes, I know of it. Yes.
Well, it's a terrible. I won't go into why it was so terrible. Believe me, that's another hour conversation. But in the mid '60s, when Richard Feiner, we all shake even mentioning that name, made his deal to distribute the silent films for television, his license included both of these shorts, because without the soundtracks, they were then regarded as silent films.
Ah, of course.
So anybody who's ever seen Feiner's series of 120 Laurel and Hardy laugh tunes, two of the films he cut up for it into excerpts of about 3 or 4 minutes each were Unaccustomed As We Are and They Go Boom. And I think it was 1975 when someone, but I can't recall who, but somebody found the 2 discs with the track, which were not perfect, and they had some cackling. They weren't perfect, but that was a very happy day. I remember when David Shepard called me into the workroom at Blackhawk Films to screen and approve the 16 millimeter answer print for Unaccustomed As We Are. And then years later for the Kirsch Group, Beta Film, CCA, etc. in Munich, when we did our physical film elements restoration and preservation on this title, and I looked this up, it was 31 years ago, we had as our picture source the same 35 millimeter full aperture nitrate work print, which Sam Sherman had found, which luckily showed only minor wear and deterioration at the reel end. So Unaccustomed As We Are, I want to mention that there's one line I like in that film, which I'm guessing that Oliver Hardy probably improvised, where he says to Mae Bush about Stan Laurel, quote, why this is a boy I've known for 5 years. So in other words, I'm sure that he just improvised that. And so that means that he's conscious of the fact that he didn't really know Stan Laurel when they made Lucky Dog, but from 1925 on, they knew each other.
That's right, yeah.
So anyway, there's more from Lewis Foster in the Men of War book, about which I will happily quote the immortal words of Oliver Hardy. everything comes to he who waits. So eventually he'll be able to read this thing. And here, as they say, the rest of the story. So that's all there is. There isn't any more.
Well,
over to you, Patrick.
Fabulous. That's just. Oh, I could just sit and listen. You know, to hear the words of Louis Foster and all these other wonderful people that you've had the chance to interview over the years is just. It's just great. I forget that I'm supposed to be interviewing you at times because I just get lost in it. It's just fantastic. And there is as you say, there is so little about Louis Foster available, whether it's IMDb or in any of the books. So to get these little insights is just fantastic, and the way he spoke about Stan laughing at the gags, it's just great.
Maybe the most interesting thing that I quoted just in what we covered today was throughout the history of the Sons of the Desert organization, where we'd have Hal Roach Studios alumni at meetings, and they'd talk about how, and even Hal Roach would say, Stan Laurel bossed the Laurel and Hardy sets. And the people who were making the films, who lived into the 70s and 80s for us to interview, they said, Stan almost directed the directors. But we have this quote that I recited from Lou Foster, where he talks about that, where he said, what was it he said, that how Stan would suggest, and then in parents nicely, always helping. So
yeah,
that's the only comment. I mean, I knew Gordon Douglas too, but I don't remember that I ever talked to him about whether or not Stan was really in charge of Saps at Sea, for instance, or Zenobia, or but this is the only director where he addresses that point. I mean, I didn't ask him a question like that. That's just something that he said.
Yeah, it's a good point, isn't it? Yeah, as you say, it's to actually get the director's perspective on that and how they felt about it. That's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah. You kind of take it as read that. I mean, it's that he was the director's director. It just rolls off the tongue now, but to get it from Foster is really interesting. Always great, Richard. You like I say, you have the gold mine of information. It's just wonderful, and we are forever in your debt. So thanks for sharing that with us.
You're very welcome.
With us
very
today.
Welcome.
It's wonderful, and you keep on teasing with this book, this Men of War book. We need to get this signed off and published because it's.
I know. I know. I hope it will be worth waiting for. I think it will be because there are certain films that once you read things that I've been sitting on for decades that others don't know, there are certain films you're never going to see the same way again.
You're teasing us all the time. It's not fair. Not fair. I mean, when we call it the Men of War book, I mean, it's kind of, it's based around Men of War, isn't it? But it goes far beyond that by the sounds of it. We're covering a lot of ground. So it's kind of, it's almost a history of the Laurel and Hardy films using Men of War as a framework
as a starting point, I guess.
Yeah. It's yeah.
Well, there are all kinds of subtext that you'll see. There's a lot about the culture at Hal Roach Studios. What was it like? How did it work? Who created it? What did people have to say about their jobs and the place where they made these films on all kinds of subjects? But it all relates to Laurel and Hardy, and we always come back to Men of War.
Yeah. Can't wait. Cannot wait.
Okay, very good. So there you are, as they say.
Fantastic. Richard, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, as always, and I can't wait till the next time.
And just as I can't wait for the next issue of the Laurel and Hardy magazine.
Yes. Well, they keep coming around pretty quick. I think we get one to bed and have a deep sigh of relief, and the next one starts to appear. So the next. But
as I said before we went on the air, so to speak, that you and Russell are doing a great job, and the current issue, they just keep getting better and better.
Oh, Bless you. Thank you for that, Richard. That's really kind. To come from you, we really appreciate that. We'll certainly take that praise.
You're very welcome.
The trouble is, we start to make a rod for our own backs because now we have to top that one.
That's true. That is true. Good luck to you there.
Yeah, we're going to need it. We're going to need it. But thank you so much, Richard, and we'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Okay, Patrick. Thanks so much. Take care.
And so there we go, the end of yet another episode, and the beginning of our journey into the talking pictures of Laurel and Hardy. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and that it may have inspired you to go back and rewatch Unaccustomed As We Are. Please do get in touch with me by email or social media, on my Facebook pages or on Twitter, and let me know your opinion on this film or on this particular part of Stan and Babe's career. And also, please do share your thoughts on this episode, because I always love to receive your feedback, whether it's good or bad. And if you're able to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else, I'd really appreciate that too. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can also find the extended edition of my audio essay on Unaccustomed As We Are, exclusive to patrons of the podcast, on patreon.com. So join me again next time as we continue the exploration of Laurel and Hardy's wonderful comedies, as we look at another divisive film in the boys' canon, Birthmarks. So thank you again to today's guests, the ever-popular Randy Skretvedt and the brilliant Richard W. Bann. Thank you, as usual, to the Bohunks Orchestra and Basta Music for the wonderful music. And last but not least, thank you for listening and spending this time with me again. And before we trip down the final set of steps, it's goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
And a very goodbye from me. Goodbye.
Thank you.